All right. So we'll kind of get things started here. So, a couple things off the top. I was asked and made aware. So for module two, the practice problems, the answer key, everything's fine there. The solutions file I put up, I was writing this out quickly and I changed a question and didn't realize that I originally had 120 over 40 was 1/3. It's clearly 3. So the slope there is kind of that -3. So I've updated the solutions file just to not cause any confusion there. So the old one is gone and just replace it. It just has the same name. So it doesn't look any different to you if you're looking at the file, but when you open it up, it will be the newer one. Also, a couple of things I wanted to mention I've had some questions on. So these participation quizzes, your scores haven't updated yet because I do have it set to where if people miss class, they can kind of get on and get it done by the end of this week on Sunday, 29th. As soon as those due dates pass, then all of the scores should be updated in the gradebook on Canvas. I might try to, I know there's a setting I can get them to post to you, to those of you who have done them. It just doesn't do it automatically or doesn't sync it. So I have to kind of do it every single day. But I'll try to do that so you can kind of see your scores even prior to that date. Now for the module quizzes, those answers you can't review until after that due date passes. It's a way for me to kind of prevent sharing. So those will be made available as soon as that due date passes. That module one, module two quiz will be due at the end of the day, Sunday. In fact, here I can add, there's that module 3 quiz and module 4 quiz will be due at the end of the day next Wednesday. So I'll have it set on module 3 and 4 that you can kind of see those results after Tuesday if you have completed the quiz. Still giving you some flexibility there, but allowing you to kind of use those as additional study materials. Although next week, and I'll kind of mention this more, really the main study material is going to be that practice exam that I already have kind of up there on Canvas. Excuse me. But once those due dates pass on the first two quizzes, you should be able to see your results and kind of start reviewing module 1 and 2 questions. Other than that, the module readings were also for 3 and 4, if you had completed them ahead of time, it wasn't syncing up since the due date hasn't passed. I've got those set now so that they should just kind of auto sync as soon as you get them done. It should throw those grades onto Canvas so that you can see those as well. You could have always seen them on Top Hat, and then they were just syncing up after the due date passes. Now it should sync up as soon as you've completed them. And that'll be kind of true for the subsequent module readings as well. Other than that, we'll add in participation quizzes for module 3. I'll kind of start this one. We'll take a look at it later on in class. And if there's no questions, we'll start diving into material here. No questions? Okay. So today, we might end class a little bit early based off of what my first section, how much we got through. I want to kind of walk us all the way through demand today. We'll start to think about supply. I might just touch on the idea of supply and we'll finish that next class. But I want to set us up. I'll probably take a lot more time going through demand today than I do supply because a lot of the same principles will apply to both of them. But we are going to be talking about markets in chapter 3. So all a market is just a combination or a group of buyers and sellers for a particular product. So this could be, we're looking at a table, we're looking at automobiles, whatever the product is. Now, all the markets we're going to look at, we're going to assume there are many, many buyers and many, many sellers so that no one has any influence on the price. Right? So this is not the idea of like the game you played Monopoly where there's one firm that owns everything. We'll talk about those later on in the semester. For right now, we're assuming what we call perfectly competitive markets. No buyer or seller has an effect on the price. Right? In these perfectly competitive markets, the other assumption we're going to make starting out is that we're looking at all goods in this market are exactly the same. So Once again, later on the semester, we'll talk about what happens if goods are slightly differentiated and how that would kind of impact what we're talking about. But we have to walk before we can run. So we start out with a simplifying assumption that no buyer or seller has any influence over the price. So there's many buyers, many sellers. So this is the idea that if I want to sell my product, there isn't only one person who I'm making a deal with. And that if someone, isn't willing to pay the price that I'm charging, I can try to sell it to somebody else who will. And then if I'm buying something, there's not just one place I can buy it from. If someone increases their price a lot, I can just go buy it from somebody else. So this is something like gasoline. So I always use gasoline, in fact, as my perfectly competitive market because gasoline is it's the same. It's 87 unleaded gasoline, right? It's the exact same product no matter where I buy it from. There's many buyers. There's gas stations in every single corner, right? Not every single corner, but you get what I mean. And then there's many, many buyers as well. So no one has any influence over the price, and they're selling the exact same product, okay? So for Module 3, we're going to use these perfectly competitive markets and kind of build our base for what we're going to talk about after Exam 1. So within these markets, we have both what we call producers and consumers. So today we're really just going to focus on consumers, and consumers are the people that buy the product, or we say they demand the product, right? So when we're talking about demand, we want to make a slight differentiation between demand and quantity demanded. So quantity demanded is just the quantity of a good that someone is willing and able to purchase at a specific price, at a single price. Okay? So the law of demand tells us that, if I go into a store, and in fact, my wife and I just went to Menards, I think it was Menards, and we were buying plants, right? Well, when we're looking at the price, we didn't know how many we wanted for our yard. We're planting a bunch of stuff. If they increase the price of whatever flower we're buying, right, or whatever tree we're buying, we're going to be willing to buy less of it, right? If they increase the price, maybe before we would have bought 5, now we're only going to buy 2, right? So this law of demand is telling us that there's this inverse relationship that when companies raise the price of a good, people are willing to or able to buy less, right? The quantity demanded would fall. So there's this inverse relationship. Now, I'll use shorthand a lot as we kind of move throughout today. So I won't always put the shorthand in the slides, but I'll do some work on the dot cam where I just use arrows, where we're thinking about these represent like directional changes. When price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. Okay. So for now, we're going to assume that this relationship is linear just to make the math easier. In practice, if you were to take the next level of microeconomics, we would see that demand, in fact, it does not have a linear relationship. The math becomes a little more complicated, but for us, we're going to keep it linear. So what is driving this law of demand? So there's really 2 things that are driving it, okay? So I'll come back to the substitution effect in a second, but the income effect, I think, is an easy one to think about. So in my flower example, let's say my wife and I are going to Menards and we want to spend $100 on plants, right? Or on a specific type of flower. Well, we look at kind of what their current, and actually I'm saying flowers. The reason why I'm saying $100 is because we bought these hydrangea trees, so they're a little bit more expensive. But let's say I have $100. I go in, and one of these hydrangea trees they're charging $10. Okay, well, we can buy 10 of them, right? We want to buy as many as possible, right? To line the side of our driveway, we'll buy 10. Well, if they increase the price to 20, we were only willing to spend up to $100. So with that same income, when they increase the price, how many can we now afford to buy? We can only buy 5. So the price goes up. The quantity demanded of these hibiscus tree things, or hydrangea tree things, our quantity demand has actually fallen. So that's one thing that's going to be driving this law of demand. The other is the substitution effect. So let's say we go in there and I have got the same $100, right? I look at the price of these hydrangea trees and I'm like, okay, they've increased it from 10 to 20. What might we do? We might be less likely to buy any of these hydrangea trees, and we might substitute away and buy a different type of flowering bush instead, right? So that's the idea of the substitution effect. When the price of a good goes up, people are more likely to not buy that good and to start buying something else that's a substitute for it. Use a different example. So let's say I go into like a restaurant or something, I want to get a hamburger or a hot dog, price of hamburgers is all of a sudden they increase it on me. What might I be more likely to do? Not buy hamburgers, but instead buy hot dogs there. All right. So when the price of this substitute good goes up, I'm buying less of that good, more of the other good. Okay. So that's also going to cause an inverse relationship. So those are the two effects that are really driving this law of demand. Okay. And later on, we'll talk about how we can kind of break down income and substitution effects in later chapters. So I'm just introducing the idea that both of them exist now. Okay. Any questions on that? All right. So we're going to first start out with this idea. There is a relationship between the price of a good and how much people are willing to buy or the quantity demanded. So we can depict this. I'm using a dumb example, Zoolander and orange mocha frappuccinos. If you don't, doesn't make any sense to you, it's a cheesy movie. And you can think of any drink from Starbucks as a, any frappuccino, okay? So we'll have what we call a demand schedule, which is really just this combination of at all these different prices, how much is this one person willing to purchase? Okay. So I can see here, if the price is $1, they're only going to be willing to get 10 of these drinks. $5, they're only going to buy 2. Okay. So that shouldn't be anything crazy. But if I've got a demand schedule, a table like this, well, I've got 2 columns. I essentially have 2 variables. I can put this into a graph. So we're going to think about how could I look at the individuals or Zoolander's demand curve from this demand schedule. All I'm going to do is put whatever the good that I'm thinking about here, orange mocha frappuccinos, put that quantity on my x-axis and put that good's price on my y-axis. Okay. So I'm going to plot all of these points. So 6, 0. Oh, no, never mind. I started at 0, 12. So at a price of 0, they demand 12 of these drinks. At a price of $1, Zoolander's only willing to buy 10 of these. $2, only willing to buy 8, so on and so forth. We would plot all of the points from our demand schedule, and that would give us our demand curve. So notice the demand curve is representing a lot of different quantity demanded points, right? So it's going to show me what price would result in different quantity demanded. And that entire curve, that relationship between price and quantity demanded, that is my demand curve. Okay. So we notice as the price goes down, quantity demanded is going up, giving us this negative inverse relationship or a negative slope. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Shouldn't be too bad yet. So if we've got a curve, or we've got an x and a y axis, well, that curve should have an equation behind it. So when we have linear demand, this is what our linear demand equation looks like. So I'll take a slight step back here. We'll switch over to the dot cam. All right, there we go. So what we're thinking about is, I've got my quantity of these orange mocha frappuccinos. I've got my price. And we had this point of what, 6. And it went down here at a price of 0. The demand is 12. So our general form, if we were looking at like a math class, it's this y is equal to mx plus b is going to be the equation that's behind just a nice linear curve or a line. Right? So for us, what is our y-axis? Well, that is going to be our price. What is on our x-axis? So here we write it out in a slightly different order, and we're using kind of different letters to represent these variables, but price is equal to some intercept plus a slope times the quantity of the good we're looking at, or in more general terms, the quantity demanded. Okay. So this is the general form of our demand curve equation. So if I wanted to write it out in the context of our example here, what would be my intercept? Well, if I'm looking at a quantity of 0. Where does this demand curve hit the intercept or hit my y-intercept? It's at a price of $6. What's my slope? Well, I still calculate slope as the change in y over the change in x, but now our y is going to be the change in the price of the good, and our x is the change in the quantity demanded. So very similar to our production possibilities curve, we can calculate this by using the two extreme points. If I'm moving from this point to this point, how much is y changing by? Right? It's going down by 6. How much is x changing by? It's going up by 12. So I have this slope of negative 1/2. Okay? So just like our production possibilities curve, our demand curve is always going to have a negative slope. There's this inverse relationship. So what is my slope? Negative 1/2 times the quantity demanded. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? So once I have this equation, I can figure out, okay, I could give you a price or I could give you the quantity demanded and you could tell me the price or quantity demanded that goes with it. So here's my first example. Let's say, I'm like, okay, if this individual buys 8 of these drinks, what is the corresponding price that would result in them buying 8 of them? Well, if I know that this is my demand equation, all I would do is say, okay, just plug in the quantity I'm interested in finding the price of. Right? When will that 8th drink be purchased? When the price is equal to what? If I do this math here, when the price is equal to 2. Right? Well, now what I could also do, a little bit more math, I guess, but let's say I told you the price is $4, even if I don't have that demand schedule in front of me, but I have the demand equation. Well, what would be the quantity demanded at a price of 4? Well, there, I'm just going to plug in the price that I'm interested in. And now it's just a little bit of algebra. Right? I subtract 4 from both sides. I add 1/2 times quantity demanded to both sides. Right? And I've got what? 1/2 times quantity demanded is equal to 6 minus 4 is 2. Multiply both sides by 2. And I get that the quantity demanded when the price is $4 is going to be, wait, did I do this math right here? 6 minus 4 is 2 times 2, yeah. Should be a quantity of 4, or a quantity demanded of 4. I should be careful in what I'm saying here. Okay, we can use that demand equation to find any of the points that are on that demand curve. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So just to kind of reiterate a couple of these things I already said, B, yeah, that slope will always be negative because of this inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Oops. And so in our example, that was 6. And the price, another way to think about, sorry, the price, the slope, another way to think about the slope, B, is it's how much the price is going to have to fall in order for that consumer or that individual to buy one more unit of that good. So in our example, with a slope of negative 1/2, what that means is they would need to lower the price by $0.50 or 50 cents in order to convince that consumer to buy one more unit of that good. Okay, so that was our kind of demand equation that we were using. I kind of already showed how we could plug in different prices or quantity demanded, or I could plug in the price to find the corresponding quantity demanded, or plug in quantity demanded to find the corresponding price. Okay. Nothing too crazy there. All right. So another way we can think about this demand curve, it's actually providing us with some additional information. Right? So I'll set this up and then I'll give you a visual to go along with it. But I kind of kept it a little bit easier initially when I described it. And I said it was like the ability of the individual to pay. So I was talking about income, things like that. Really what the demand curve represents is the ability and willingness to pay for different quantities of the good. Okay. So It's the ability and willingness to pay. When am I willing to buy something? When that marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. So if the demand curve is actually going to tell me the marginal benefit, those prices that were associated with the first, second, and third quantity of that good, those prices will be also represent the marginal benefit. So why? Okay. So if I'm looking at this, so here was that quantity of these orange mocha frappuccinos. Here was the price. And we had 6. What was the other point? 5 and 2. So here was like my demand curve, right? Where I can think about if I wanted to know, okay, that very first unit, right? I've got my demand equation, and I know that if I plug a 1 in to that quantity, that the corresponding price needs to be $5.50. So what does that mean? Well, we know someone will choose to buy something as long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. What is the marginal cost to a consumer, someone who's buying something? Well, that marginal cost is simply price. So we know that a consumer will be willing to buy something as soon as that price is low enough to where it's exactly equal to their marginal benefit. So for example, here, if the price is 6, well, they're buying 0. That must mean for that very first small, like not even the one, not even a whole unit, you know, we could separate this not into drinks, but into ounces. For that first ounce even of these drinks, the marginal benefit, if I'm choosing not to buy any of this good, it must be that that marginal benefit is below 6, right? Because if the marginal benefit was below the price, I wouldn't buy that good. So at what price would I first be willing to buy that first drink? Not any prices here. So it must be that my marginal benefit is still below all of these prices, right? The very first price that's equal to my marginal benefit, that's where we'll see the consumer purchase that good. Okay. So these prices, right, at these different quantity demanded, really just represent this is the price where I will first start buying that first unit. So that must be where it's exactly, that price is exactly equal to my marginal benefit. And then notice for the second one, well, if the price was $5.50, will I buy the second unit? Well, no, we didn't buy the second unit until the price fell to 5. So that must mean that that price was above the marginal benefit for that second unit. We won't buy that second unit until the price falls low enough to where it's exactly equal to my marginal benefit. That's going to be at a price of 5. So now I'll choose, if my marginal benefit for the second unit is 5, now I will choose to buy that second one as well. And if the price is lower, well, then the price is still going to be less than the marginal benefit for that very first unit. And then so on and so forth. Right? So our demand curve, right, and this demand equation, you could actually think of it like this. If I gave you a different values for the quantity of this good, we could think of price as really representing the marginal benefit of each one of those quantities. So if I wanted to know the marginal benefit of the first unit, I would just plug in a 1. That would be $5.50. Same thing as the price. If I want to know the marginal benefit of the second unit, I'll plug in, not a few, I'll plug in a quantity of 2, and that would be $5. And then so on and so forth. So by simply plugging the quantity into my demand curve equation, that would give me the marginal benefit of that quantity demanded, right? That number of units for that good. Okay. Any questions there before we keep going? Okay. So we'll notice, well, in order to buy more of the good, we said the price must fall. But if that price also reflects the consumer's marginal benefit, we notice that as we look at higher and higher quantities, what's happening to the marginal benefit? It is going down, right? Or, similar to last chapter, we have these diminishing marginal benefits. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Before we keep moving, I do want to mention another way to think about this. I always try to like paint things in multiple lights. It connects one way might connect with you better than another. Another way of thinking about why there's diminishing marginal benefits is if I'm buying something, right, inherently I'm not spending that money on something else. So that as I buy more and more of this product, I'm starting to give up things that might be more and more valuable to me, right? So the value of buying more of these orange mocha frappuccinos, I'm giving up more other goods. Each time I'm spending more money, I have to give up what I value the next highest and the next highest. So that's kind of the idea. I'm giving up more and more. My marginal benefit of consuming more of these orange mocha frappuccinos is actually declining. But also, I think another way of just thinking about it's like we talked about marginal benefits diminishing before. If I think about hot day like today, and the very first drink, I'd be willing to pay a lot of money to have one of these frappuccinos to cool down and to get some caffeine in me. But once I have one, maybe I want a second one, but I'm not willing to pay near as much for it, right? Or you can kind of see this play out in practice. If you look at prices, like at Starbucks or something, you have different sizes, right? Like 16 ounces, 20 ounces, 24. Generally, if you want to get like a 16-ounce coffee, I don't know, it might cost you $4 or something like that. Well, if we really valued it the exact same, then 20 ounce should be, well, 16 ounces divided by 4, each ounce was kind of costing me what? Each 4 ounces, sorry, was costing me $1. So it should be a whole dollar more. A lot of times to get the 20 ounce, it won't be $5, it'll only be $4.50. That's because we know the marginal benefit of each additional ounce is going to be lower and lower. Um, okay, so with this idea of diminishing marginal benefits in mind, we'll then kind of push this a little bit further, right? So if I'm thinking about individual demand, that's what we were looking at before. We're now going to talk about market demand, right? So individual demand was one individual's quantity demanded at all these different prices. What if we now have two individuals, right? So I've got Ken now as well. Well, market demand, if the current price was $6, Zoolander won't buy any, but maybe Ken will buy 5. So the total market demand at that price would be 0 plus 5 or 5. If I lower the price to 5, Zoolander's buying 2, Ken's buying 6. Total market demand at that price would be 8. So on and so forth, right? So how do I get market demand? I simply add up the quantity of every individual in that market. We know that we said there are many buyers and sellers, so we're going to have many buyers in this market. So to get market demand, we would just add up each individual's demand curve. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Okay. I want to give you a visual of this as well, right? So we can think about when we're looking at a product, individuals' demand curves might be like down here. So this is like the individual demand curve of person 1 and person 2. What would the total market demand curve be? Well, at this price, I can kind of say, okay, here's the quantity demanded from person 1. Here's the quantity demanded from person 2. Just to put some numbers to it, maybe that's 5 and 10. At that same price, what would market demand be? It would be the sum of those two, right? So our market demand here would be 15. And that's going to be true at every single price. We'd be adding up the quantities. So we're going to end up with our market demand curve is kind of the sum of all those individual demand curves. Okay. And kind of do this a little bit inappropriate to scale because it technically should start here since this person's buying 0, but this is the general idea. And as I add more and more people into this market, more demand curves, that's just going to cause, I'm adding up more and more values. That's just going to cause my demand curve for the market to be even higher. Okay. And this is a little bit of foreshadowing of something we'll talk about later on. Okay. All right. So once we have market demand, right, it works exactly the same way in a lot of ways as when we talked about individual demand. Right? So we would still have prices. We would still have the corresponding quantity demanded. We could plot all of those points. And now we've got our market demand curve. We could also come up with an equation for what that demand curve is. Same way, we would look at the intercept, the y-intercept, and then calculate what the slope is. And then we would have our market demand equation. Okay. So here, what? I actually don't even have the intercept, but we would know that the slope is what? Change in y is going from, say, 6 to 5, that's -1. How much is quantity going up by? 3. So there we would have a slope of, -3. Okay. No, not -3. Sorry, -1/3. 1 over 3. -1 over 3, right? -1/3. Okay. Any questions on that? So you would still calculate the slope. Let's see if I can get this to go away. There we go. Of your market demand curve the same way, looking for the change in y, so -1 over the change in x, which was 3. Here we have -1/3. Now, one thing, and this won't really pop up in questions as much, but just to be kind of complete in our discussion, we said that for the individual demand curve, the slope represented the marginal benefit of every single unit or every quantity for that individual. Right? We could get the marginal benefit of the fifth unit, the 25th unit for that individual. For the market demand curve, it's not telling us the marginal benefit of any one person. A way to think about it is, since we're adding up every individual's demand curve, the slope of our market demand is kind of telling us like the average marginal. It's not quite as simple as the average, but it's like the average marginal benefit of all of the individuals in that market. So just to kind of connect to something we've already talked about, you might be kind of thinking or wondering about. Okay. So with this idea, we can take all these individual demand curves, come up with what market demand is. We're going to start to think about, once we have market demand, all that's telling us is this relationship between the price and the total quantity demanded from all individuals in that market. Now, that's what the curve tells us, but we know there's a lot of other things that impact how much of something someone buys other than just its price. How much income do they have, right? How, what are the price of other goods, right? A lot of other things matter. So the demand curve assumes everything else is being held constant, okay? Now, when these other things change, it doesn't impact the relationship between the price of that good and the quantity demanded, but it might, so it doesn't change that relationship in terms of like the slope, but it might impact how much people would be able to or willing to buy at that price, right? So price changes and how that will impact the quantity demanded, that is left unchanged by all these other things, right? However, when these other things change, the overall amount that someone might buy at a specific price, that could change. And I think once I draw this out, it'll hopefully make a little more sense here. So a change in any of these other things, it doesn't change the slope of our demand curve, it shifts the entire curve, right? That slope is what told us how much would I have to lower the price for someone to buy one more unit of this good. That was the slope. That stays the same when income changes, the price of other goods change. What can change, though, is that we'll see an entire shift in the demand curve if income changes or the price of other goods change. Okay? So what does this look like visually? Okay, so let's start out with a demand decrease. Okay, if I have a demand decrease, right, let's say I initially start out, and at this price, this is the quantity demanded. Okay. If I have a demand decrease, that means at the same price, right, I am able and willing to buy less than I was before. In fact, let me draw these out for you. I think that'll I didn't do this in my earlier section, but I think this will make sense. I think it'll be a good way to look at it. So I'm going to use an example that we'll talk about later, so it'll save us a little bit of time. But let's think about something like income, right? So this is my current demand, right? So this is demand 1. And at the current price, this is my quantity demanded, okay? If I have less income, then even if the price is the same, so this is an example, like if I walk in into a restaurant and I want to get something to eat and I've got $20 and I don't know, hamburgers are $5, I can buy 4 of them. If the price is the same, hamburgers are still $5 an hour, but I walk in and I only have $10, so I have less income, well, now I can only buy 2 of them. And if I only had $5, I, could only buy 1 of them. And so at every single price, right, I'm going to be able to buy less than I was before. So we think about these leftward shifts. If I had like less income, I can buy less no matter what the price is, right? So at every single price, when my income goes down, I can afford to buy less of this good. I'm going to see the demand decrease. So these leftward shifts would be demand decreases. If I have more income, then even if the price of that good is the same, when I walk into the store, I can not only afford to buy how much I was before, but I can now buy even more. And even if the price was up here, with more income, I can afford to buy even more. So these rightward shifts, those are going to represent demand increases. Right? So rightward shifts in the demand curve are increases. And when we have leftward shifts, those would represent demand decreases. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. So demand decrease, so shift to the left at every single price, quantity demanded is lower. So notice it's a shift in the entire demand curve. So at every price, the quantity demanded is now lower. Demand increases at every single price, the quantity demanded is now higher. Okay. Oh. So what are some of the things that are going to cause these demand increases and decreases? Okay. So the first thing we'll talk about is just the number of buyers, and we've kind of already seen why this is the case. Right? So if we have more buyers, that just means that at every single price, remember when we had those individual demand curves, we said, how do we get market demand? We added those up. So if I have 2 people, I add up their demand curve to get market demand. All right, that's pretty high. What if I have 3 people, right? Well, now when I add the third person, so in our earlier example, when we added Ken in, or the market demand wasn't just Zoolander's demand, it was Ken plus Zoolander. And then what if we had a third person, right? Well, if we had a third person in, we're going to have whatever the market demand was before, but at every single price, we now have a third person buying some of this product. So at every single price, we are now seeing a higher quantity demanded for the market when we add buyers to a market. Okay. So an increase in the number of buyers increases overall market demand. And that, I think, is pretty intuitive, right? Now, it doesn't often happen, but it could. What happens, like, so I always think of like a market like, I don't know, uh, network television, right? It used to be that everybody watching TV was tuning into the same 4 networks, right? Analog TV. Now that there's Netflix, Hulu, all of these different streaming, there's tons of different shows out there. For general free network TV, the number of consumers of that is going to be much lower. So what's happened to the overall market demand for something like traditional network analog TV? It's went down, right? So you can actually see a decrease in the number of buyers for different products. Also, technically, I think the birth rate is below 2 now, so we're not quite replacing ourselves. So eventually, over time, what's going to be happening in every market, we're going to see fewer and fewer potential buyers, right? So we often think about just an increase in the number of buyers, increasing demand. It can work the other way as well. right? Now, this is one where I kind of already walked you through an example of how income could shift demand. We said that when people have more income, right, that generally they will buy more of something. They can afford to buy more. So we said demand is the ability or the willingness and ability to pay. So that ability is coming from income. So for most goods, we think about there's this direct positive relationship. When I have more money, I will buy more of that product, or people will buy more of that product. Okay. And then vice versa. If I have less money, I buy less of it. So these are most goods: clothing, computers, cars. Now, so we kind of already talked through these normal goods. Right? We have another category of goods, and everything works exactly the opposite for these. Right? So these are going to be inferior goods. So inferior goods are going to be products where if I have more money, higher income, I actually buy less of them than I was before. So there's going to be this negative or inverse relationship between income and demand when we're looking at inferior goods. And I'm going to write a shorthand of this in a second, but I'll kind of give you some examples to help you think about inferior goods so that you don't have to like memorize all of this, so you don't have to memorize the shorthand. You can intuitively think through this as well. So think of a normal good for yourself. This would be another easy way when you're looking at quizzes and exams. Just think of something to you that if you have more money, you're always going to want to buy more of it. So maybe this is like, I don't know, a new car. Right? If I keep having more and more money, I want to have a garage full of cars, right? For my wife, this would be dogs. The more and more money we have, I think she'd buy a compound so we could have more and more dogs. So inferior goods, think of something that's inferior to you. I'll give you some examples, but I would think of a good that's inferior to you. Every person might have different viewed goods differently in terms of normal or inferior. So one of the age-old examples that people use when talking about inferior goods is ramen noodles, right? So when you're in college, you don't have a lot of money, the quantity demanded for ramen noodles you have might be really high. Once you start to go out in the real world, you get a job after college, you're making money, you don't eat ramen noodles near as much, and your quantity demanded falls. The one I always use is I think about like when I was in college and even in grad school, I was always renting places. And so my demand for laundromats was very high, right? My quantity demanded for time, at the laundromat was really high. Once I got more money, I had more income, I could afford a place that had, a washing machine. Well, now my demand for laundromats went all the way down to zero, right? So for some inferior goods, when I have more money, I'm not only going to buy less of them, I might stop buying them completely. Okay. Another example, right? I might have to rely on public transportation if I don't have enough money. As I have more and more income, I eventually won't rely on public transportation. I'll buy my own car. And so anything that you would buy less of if you had more money, that's an inferior good, right? So the other one I always use, I haven't bought Natty Ice or Natty Light since I was 20. Well, I couldn't buy when I was 20. So I was 21. um, so, you know, basically we think about these inferior goods. It's usually things that you're only buying out of necessity, right? You just don't have a lot of money. And so this is the thing that you're kind of subject to having to be able to afford, right? Once again, demand is the willingness and ability to pay. Okay. All right. Any questions on that idea? So the shorthand that I typically would kind of write out for this, just to kind of keep it all concise in one place, would be for normal goods, I can think about it when income goes up, I'm just going to buy more, or we would have a demand increase, which we said was a rightward shift. For normal goods, if income goes down, I have less money, I can afford to buy less of this, so my demand decreases. However, if we're thinking about inferior goods, when income goes up, these are going to be inferior products that we were only buying out of necessity. There, if I have more money, I'm actually going to stop buying this good. Right? And then if I have less money, now out of necessity, I have to buy more of that good. Okay. So completely opposite effects of income changes if it's an inferior versus a normal good. So if I ever ask you, there's an income change, what happens to does demand shift right or left, or does it increase or decrease? I'd have to tell you whether or not it was a normal or an inferior good. Okay. So the next thing that we'll talk about are the prices of related goods. Okay. So the first type of relationship we'll talk about are substitute goods. I think this one is easier to think about in the second category. So substitute goods are just things that could be used in place of each other. So what example did I use here? Pepsi and Coke, right? If I walk into a store and let's say the current price of Pepsi and Coke was the same, but then I walk in, all of a sudden Pepsi doubles in price. Am I going to be more or less likely to buy Pepsi or Coke than I was before? Well, if Pepsi's twice as expensive, less likely to buy that. Coke is now relatively cheaper. So when the price of Pepsi goes up, what happens to the demand for Coke? It actually also goes up, right? Because we would substitute away from that relatively more expensive good towards that relatively cheaper good. This is kind of an old example since laptops are about the same price now as desktop computers. Pens and pencils are another kind of good example. If all of a sudden the price of pens skyrockets, what are people going to do? They're going to start writing everything in pencils, right? So when the price of pens goes up, the demand for pencils also goes way up, right? I'm substituting away towards that other substitute good. Okay. So they're moving in the same direction. The price of some other good is going up. The demand that I have for the other good is going to also go up. So I'll kind of bounce back and forth here. So if I'm thinking about more general, let's say I have two goods, X and Y. If these two goods are substitutes, when the price of X goes up, the demand for good Y is going to go up as well. And then if the price of X goes down, so if Pepsi all of a sudden is a lot cheaper, then the demand for this other good is also going to go down. So I'll give you another example here to kind of pick on. I was a Purdue grad, so don't hold it against me too much. But let's say I have in-state, someone's wanting to go to a college in state in Indiana. Just want to kind of give you some other examples. We don't always have to think about these goods as like Pepsi or a table, a chair, all this other stuff. Let's say the price of, well, here, we'll do it this way. Let's say the price of a Purdue degree goes up. What's going to happen to the demand for an IU degree? Well, if I'm making a choice between these two large state colleges and one of them is all of a sudden more expensive, if I view them fairly, pretty equal in terms of like the product that they're giving me, once again, kind of a perfectly competitive market, well, then the demand for IU degrees, people are going to be less likely to go to Purdue, more likely to want to go to IU. Here we would think about universities, really, as long as they're of the same caliber, are substitute goods. Okay. Now, the other type of good that we have is going to be what we call complementary goods. So I've got this in the slides, but I'll kind of talk through it since we're here already. So if I have complementary goods, when the price of X goes up, right, complementary goods are going to be something that I use at the exact same time. So there's a lot of food examples. I think even in my slides, I like peanut butter and jelly, bagels and cream cheese. I think the one that, you can argue, well, I sometimes put cream cheese and I don't eat it with a bagel. Well, that's true, right? They wouldn't always be complements. But two goods that I can think of that are always going to be complements, if I have gasoline and gasoline-powered vehicles. So if the price of gas goes up, right, and I have a choice between buying electric and gas-powered vehicles, when the price of gas goes up, what happens to my demand for, say, a gas guzzling SUV? Well, now I can only drive this thing if I also pay for gas. So when the price of gas goes up, what happens to the demand for gasoline powered vehicles? It would actually go down. Because to use this good, I have to buy the other one. They're complementary. Okay. I'll give you another, and then the exact opposite would be true as well, right? If the price of X, here, price of Y goes down. So the price of X goes down. Hold on. This lined up with this. This is going to line up with this, right? This is kind of the more general term. Here I gave you an example. You could also see that a price decrease is going to cause demand for that complementary good to go up. Here I'll give you another example of this. So I'll kind of tie it up to here. So if I have complementary goods, let's think about if the price of rent in Bloomington went way up, right? Well, if in order to attend IU, and obviously I know there's dorms, things like that, let's just assume that I'm not going to live in the dorm and that I have to rent a place in Bloomington. If the rental prices in Bloomington goes way up, what happens to the demand for IU degrees? Well, in order to attend IU in person, I have to live there. So if the rental price is higher, am I more or less likely to want to attend IU? Less likely, right? So this is like a problem that schools that are like in large cities really struggle with because their rental prices are really high, which decreases the demand for their products. Right? Any questions on this idea? So I've got kind of this all, I've had the gasoline example that we already kind of talked through. Once again, just like with normal and inferior goods, I would think of two goods that to you definitely make sense that they're substitutes and two goods that definitely make sense that they're complements. And then always think of those goods when you're dealing with those type of problems. Okay. Any other questions on that before we keep moving? All right, so we'll come back to expectations here in a second, but I want to take a look at these participation problems for the day. And I think we'll go through these relatively quick because it shouldn't be too bad based off of what we've talked about already. So I'm looking at ramen noodles and I'm telling you it's an inferior good. And the average income in the US goes down. So if people have less money, then for an inferior good, remember these were goods that were being bought out of necessity. Well, if I don't have as much money, I might have to buy more of these goods or I might have to rely on ramen noodles to eat. So if my income goes down for an inferior good, we would see demand decrease, right? No, that would only be true if it was a normal good. When it's an inferior good, if I have less income, I'm actually going to buy more of it. So I'm going to have a demand increase, which visually we can think about. If the current price stayed the same, the amount that you would demand of ramen noodles when you have less money is going to go up, right? So this rightward shift would represent that demand increase. Okay. Any questions on that? If it was a normal good, then I would see that when income goes down, demand actually decreases. Now, if I'm looking at the price of ramen noodles, the good that I'm also looking at, if the price of ramen noodles goes down, what's going to happen to the demand curve for ramen noodles? Well, nothing happens to the demand curve. I'm changing the price of the good, right? Things like changes in income, changes in the price of other goods, all of these were some of these other factors that would shift the curve. When the price of the good itself changes, remember the demand curve tells us the relationship between price and the corresponding quantity demanded. So when the price of ramen noodles falls, we move to a different quantity demanded point on the same demand curve. Okay, so that would be depicted by C here. And then one more. Let's say I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for lunch, SpaghettiOs or ramen noodles. If the price of SpaghettiOs goes down, what's going to happen to the demand for ramen noodles? So here I've got substitute goods, a change in the price of SpaghettiOs. They're now relatively cheaper, so more people are going to choose SpaghettiOs instead of ramen noodles. So what's happening to the demand for ramen noodles? It's actually going down, right? People are buying more SpaghettiOs, fewer ramen noodles. So that would mean at the same price, the quantity demanded for ramen noodles is going down, and that's going to be true at every single price, giving us this leftward shift in our demand curve, which represents a decrease in demand. Okay. Any questions over any of those problems? Okay. All right. So I'm going to return to the slides here. So hopefully those will be relatively, easy points. Like I said, when we work through these, just paying attention, you should be able to get on now, get that done. If you're here doing it live, you could have had it pulled up at the exact same time we're going through it, right? All right. So another thing we're going to talk about, excuse me, are expectations. So the first one is kind of easy. So income expectations, it works the exact same way as income. So normal goods and inferior goods, whether I have more income or whether I expect more income, the effects are the same. So if we said for a normal good, if I have more income, demand would increase. So I see a rightward shift in the demand curve. If I expect to have more income, what do people do so that their current demand would still increase? They'll take out a loan, right? So even if I expect to have higher income, I start acting today as though I already have that income. So for normal goods, if I expect more income, my current demand will increase for normal goods. Now for inferior goods, if I expect to have more income tomorrow, right? If I, just let's say I'm fresh out of college, I just signed this job. I know over the next year I'm going to make a good amount of money. My current demand for inferior products, I expect to have more money over the next year. My current demand, even though I don't have that money yet, my current demand is actually going to go down for inferior products. So it still works the same way as if I actually had the money. Right? So income expectations work the exact same way as if I actually have more or less income. Right? All right, sorry for that delay. The lights timed out in an hour, so I have to hit them. Now, the one that works a little bit differently are going to be price expectations. Okay. So here I'll kind of write this out using shorthand to think about how price expectations are going to impact consumers. So if I think or I expect prices to be higher tomorrow, this is an expectation, what's going to happen to current demand? So if I think the price of gas, for example, let's say all this stuff in the Middle East, I think the price of gas is going to skyrocket. If the price of gas I think will be higher tomorrow, what might I do today? Rush to the gas station and get gas. So higher expected prices currently could cause my demand to actually go up. Because if I buy it today, I'm not paying that higher future price, right? I'm paying the relatively cheaper current price. So changes in the current price of a good, those will just move you to different points on the demand curve. Changes in the expected price or future price of a good, those will cause shifts in the entire current demand curve. Okay. And then if I have expectations that the price is going to go down, right? So, what's coming up? Prime Day, right? So my wife's got a million things sitting in our shopping cart on Amazon that why doesn't she currently demand them? Why does she not currently buy them? Well, because she thinks if they go on sale on Prime Day, she expects the price might be lower, right? So she wants to buy it a week from now as opposed to today. So lower expected prices actually leads to her current demand being lower for those products, right? She's trying to wait to buy those when the price is cheaper. Okay. Any questions on this idea? So you want to be careful when you're kind of reading through these problems. If you're told about I hit one too many times. If you're told about an expected future price, higher or lower, you're thinking about how does that impact current demand. It actually works the exact opposite of when we're thinking about the current price and the current quantity demanded. Okay. So this is kind of a catch-all category that I won't waste too much time on, but right, we have all these things that can change: price of related goods, income, the number of consumers. These are things that we can understand the relationship and the cause and effect relationship that exists. There's some things that we just, who knows, right? It's going to be what we call tastes and preferences. Sometimes the demand for a product increases or decreases for God knows what reason. There was a time where people paid money for pet rocks. There was a time where people were actively going out and buying, spending more. I mean, I don't think you should spend any money. We're purchasing fidget spinners, right? Why? It was a fad, right? At the current time, people had tastes and preferences for it, right? It could be that, it's a status thing that all, for whatever reason, all of a sudden having this particular brand of something makes you socially, it gives you some social status. It might increase the demand for that product. Maybe there's something that all of a sudden has a stigma associated with it. So that might then decrease your demand for that product. These aren't really going to be things I give you a lot of examples of because they're very specific to whatever the product you're looking at is. And like I said, it's a catch-all category because we're really not sure always what drives these tastes and preferences. Okay. All right, so we got one more. So I'll talk through this and then kind of give you a visual. So taxes and subsidies will also cause us to see shifts in supply or shifts in demand. So kind of think about why with taxes, why could they decrease demand? Well, I'll give you kind of the easy way to think about it. If you're taxed when you buy something, essentially the price of that good could be exactly what it was before. So let's say it was $10. Well, if there's a sales tax of 10%, now the actual price you'll pay is the $10 plus $1 tax. You're actually going to be paying 11. So before, if I was only, remember, that price I'm willing to pay, that represents my marginal benefit. If I was willing to pay $10 before, now with the additional tax, I have to pay 11. That marginal cost is now going to be above my marginal benefit, and I wouldn't buy that good. So taxes are going to cause us to see decreases in demand. And I think that's fairly intuitive, right? It's making something more expensive. We're going to see people buy less of it. So we see this shift in the entire demand curve with taxes, right? Leftward shift, a decrease. Think about it this way. If I only was willing to pay $20, well, if previously the price was 20, I would have bought it. But now, if there's a $5 tax on the good, the price that I'd be willing to pay, I'm only willing, to pay for a price of 15 because then the total cost to me would be 15 plus 5 or the same 20 that I was willing to pay before. Here, I'll show you another way of thinking about these taxes visually. So let's say I get some more black markers. So I've got the quantity, price of some good. This was the idea that here was my current demand curve. Whatever number of units this was, I was willing to pay. My marginal benefit was 20. Right? Well, now if there's a $5 tax, right, I can think about it as, okay, at that same price, right, I am no longer willing to pay $20 because I'm actually going to be paying $25. Right? So the amount that I'm willing to pay is 20. If there's a $5 tax, I'm only willing to pay 15. And then that would be true at every single point. So we would have this leftward shift or a decrease in demand with taxes. Okay. Now, on the flip side, what if I gave people money to do something? So let's say I subsidized a good. So some examples of this, you get subsidies for attending college, right? There's like these Pell Grants and like that. They're essentially kind of giving you money back. Or another good example is like food stamps, right? You don't think of it as a subsidy, but if you use those food stamps to buy something, it's essentially lowering the cost to all those whatever food you're buying. So if you're giving people money to buy something, then that would mean at the same price, they're now willing to buy more than they were before. Or if they were wanting to buy the same amount, they now would kind of have, oh, the marginal benefit still is 20, but now I'm also being given a subsidy that has a value to it as well. So at every point, we would kind of have this higher marginal benefit, whatever the old marginal benefits were, plus this subsidy. So with subsidies, we would actually see an increase in demand. And we're going to talk more in depth, I think, module 6 about taxes and subsidies. So I just wanted to kind of set us up once we get there to have somewhat of a background. For right now, intuitively, if it's easier for you to think about, so, you know, so if it's easier for you to think about right now, with taxes, that's making something more expensive to consumers, we're going to see that demand decreases. Subsidies, if I'm giving people money to do something, what is that going to do to demand? It's going to make them more likely to want to buy it, and so that will cause a demand increase. That's you can kind of just use the intuition for right now. We'll talk, really analyze the taxes and subsidies in more in depth in a later module. Okay. So all of these things are going to cause demand increases or decreases. I have them all kind of summarized here. So for a normal good, increases in income would increase demand. For an inferior good, decreases in income, increase demand, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So here's kind of your summary of all of these demand shifters. This might be kind of a good slide to have, as you're studying. This kind of has everything in one place. All right. Any questions on that? Okay. So I said that we might start demand. I want to kind of keep the sections at the same point. So this is where we actually stopped in my earlier section. So I'll stop here for today. Tomorrow, just to kind of mention some things though before we get out of here, I will probably go through the supply stuff much quicker than I did demand because a lot of it is very similar. It's just looking at it through the lens of the producers or the sellers of a good instead of the consumers. So a lot of the same principles will kind of pop up and show up. So I'll probably go through that a little bit quicker, really saving us more time to start to think about equilibrium and then how changes in supply and demand impact that equilibrium. So we'll go through all of this tomorrow. It might spill over a little bit into next Monday's class. I don't think so. I think we should have plenty of time to kind of get through all of this tomorrow. But in the rare event that it does, shortages and surpluses, we might save until Monday. Like I said, I think we'll get through all of it tomorrow. But I do want to mention I probably will go a little bit quicker through this supply stuff, kind of saving us more time for the topics that I think are a little bit more difficult. So with that in mind, should do it. I'm going to stop the recording, kind of leave this open up for those of you who have questions. Otherwise, I will see you tomorrow.